All right, gang, my name is Ramon Purcell, and I'm with Boneyard Safari, and behind me is the Philippine Mars. So I want to share with you a bit of her history and take a tour on the interior of the aircraft. She was built in 1944. The Philippine Mars was one of 7 Martin Mars aircraft built. She is a traditional flying boat. She has beaching gear, so she has no landing gear. And her purpose, initially, the Martin Mars's purpose was to be actually a long-range patrol bomber. It was quickly determined at the outbreak of World War II that she was too slow, and so the decision was made to convert them into cargo aircraft. So they could move passengers and cargo, could move anywhere from 20 to 30,000 pounds of cargo through those doors right there. So there's a hoist system, and that would actually help load in the equipment. The aircraft's pretty significant because it served from 1944 to 1956, at which point the 4 aircraft that were remaining in the United States inventory, United States Navy's inventory, were retired and they were sold for scrap. Now, a group in Canada that was a part of a series of logging companies decided, hey, here's an opportunity to get 4 aircraft that we could turn into water bombers. At the time, those water bombers that were being used in Canada to put out the forest fires were only hauling about 500 gallons, maybe up to 1,000 gallons of water. So it would take them some time to put out a forest fire. The huge improvement that the Philippine Mars and her sisters could do was they could haul 7,000 gallons of water. And we learned that with that 7,000 gallons of water, they could put out 80% of the fire in the first day with multiple drops, depending on the size. So it was a big transformation in firefighting and gave the Philippine Mars a second life. And so built in 1944, and here we are in 2025, and she's now here at Pima Air and Space. So we've been contracted with Pima Air and Space to document the journey of the Philippine Mars from her landing at Lake Pleasant, Arizona, down here to Pima Air and Space. And today we're actually going to go explore the aircraft. And in the last 8 months that I've spent almost every single day of my life with this aircraft, I've been given the opportunity to learn a lot of things that have been very humbling personally, and it's been an amazing outpouring of love from the public that have shared their stories and stories about their family members that have worked on this aircraft and her sisters. So we're going to go explore and take a look at the interior, and I'll share with you a little bit more. All right, let's climb aboard the Philippine Mars and go for a tour. Welcome aboard. So now we're aboard the Philippine Mars. So she's 2 stories. We're on the lower deck, and below us are 6 fuel tanks containing about 12,000 gallons roughly of fuel. While we're down here, we want to look at a couple things. Down here, she's very much a boat. You'll notice the portholes, you'll notice the hatches. The hatches are essentially how we get in and out of the aircraft with the stairs. And when she was in the water, they would open those up for passengers to come aboard. We'll talk about the cargo doors up front a little later, but that's how they would bring cargo in versus passengers here. So with that, let's take a walk upstairs and check out the rest of the aircraft. So now that we're upstairs, we're actually in the tail section, and the really cool part of this is the amount of history that's in here. So when you look around, you can actually see the original paint and the original aluminum, and then you'll notice something that's in a little bit better condition, and these were patches over the years. So whether there was a ding or stretching or stress on the aircraft, they would actually replace the skin. Above us, if you'll notice the 2 white tubes, one is for the rudder and one is for the elevator. So red's for the elevator and yellow is for the rudder. And the cool part is, as we go back here in this tighter and tighter section, for the rear control surfaces of the aircraft, they're located here. So this is for the rudder, and then that is for the elevator. So it's pretty cool design, and you've got to think about this 1944 and what aircraft were out there. This is hydraulically boosted, and the boost tanks behind us, or in front of me, but the whole operation, because of the size of the aircraft, had to have a hydraulic boost versus regular lines in comparison to like a B-17. So here are those two pieces, and then right out here are the controls for the elevator. Now, there's two portholes, and when she was flying, whether for the Navy or while in Canada, there would be somebody back here while it was in the water looking out to make sure there was no boats, no anything behind it, or she was going to bump into it. So with that, we're going to go back forward and keep exploring. So up here, there are a couple things we want to show you. So the first thing is the hidden compartment aboard the aircraft. Now this little piece opens up, and right down there is a hatch. Now on the back of the aircraft is the other side of this hatch, and it's shaped like a heart. So we lovingly like to say that this is the heart of the Philippine Mars. And that was used whenever they were in the water and had to hook up to a mooring buoy. So that's how they would access that. Now up here, we'll take a look at a couple of things. Open this up just because it's nice, toasty, warm September. But any other aircraft or boat, it's got a hatch. So you notice the dogging mechanism here. So this opens up and then gets hooked in there. And then you'll notice this component right here, which pulls out, is for mooring. So they'll run rope line through here, obviously when it's down in, but this locks down in here. And this component right here keeps the ropes from dinging on the side of the aircraft. So very much the boat aspect for the Philippine Mars. And storage is pretty darn simple. It's just down and then in. So as we make our way forward, up here was more passenger space and cargo. During her time in the Navy, they actually had the option to either put seats in here or litters for any wounded troops. So during the Korean War, the aircraft actually was shuttling wounded troops all the way back to either Guam or to Hawaii. And they had two sides, and as you can see, the two pieces here and all the way through, that mechanism was locked in up here, and then they could convert this to litters. So pretty impressive, the dual use of this aircraft. And as we walk forward, we'll notice the two hatches that are lifted up, and those were from the entryway that we came in just earlier downstairs. So simple system, the way it was pulled up, and you can literally just do it with one hand. So that's pretty impressive. Above us, you'll notice the same tubes from back controlling the rudder and the elevator. And then one other thing to share with you, you'll notice this little piece right here, and this was for ventilation while flying. So the aircraft wasn't pressurized, and because of that, they needed cool air. They wouldn't be at high altitude, and flying over the Pacific at a lower altitude, it's going to be warm. So because of that, they would actually need air in here. And you'll notice this tray, and the reason the tray is there is to be able to collect any moisture so it wouldn't be dripping into the aircraft. And that moisture would then be run all the way down this line and out the aircraft. So pretty ingenious system for the 1940s when they had no computers and they just had to solve a simple problem of keeping the moisture out of the aircraft. As we move forward, another empty space here, and this again was for either litters or passengers, so they would put a couple seats in. Now keep in mind, outside of us, we're at the trailing edge of the wing, so, and behind the engine, so it'd be pretty darn noisy. We're gonna go up forward into the center wing box area. So you'll pardon all of the yellow tubing in here. So as we're working, we've needed air conditioning because the aircraft is blue, so significantly warm. And the first thing I want to point out here are the two auxiliary power units. So one over here, this powers engine 1 and 2, and then the other one to my right is to power engines 3 and 4. So this essentially got the engines started and would run extra power if the aircraft needed that. And what's additionally interesting to it, a couple components, you'll notice the tubes right here, and that's the exhaust. So it would go out to the trailing edge of the wing box and then out the top of the aircraft, which was a pretty clever system. Now, this little mechanism or setup here and the tubes, it was for being able to extinguish the APU if there was a fire. So heaven forbid this actually caught on fire, this could be put out, and so that setup, they would have to step back through the hatch and then activate the fire suppression system from out there. They'd actually have to close that door because it wouldn't be a good ending to be in here with the fire suppression system running at the same time. So with that, back in the space, two things we'll show you here. You'll notice the wonderful ladder that's right in front of me, and that actually goes all the way up to the top of the aircraft, and you can climb out on the wing. So for any of the crew that needed to access the wing of the aircraft or the top of the aircraft, they generally would go out here. There's another hatch up forward, and we'll talk about that in a little bit. The other thing I'll show you here, there's two other hatches going out on either side, and that was to access the trailing edge of the wing, and there was actually also storage in there for any of the equipment that they needed to work on the engines. So there was a space in there and they could tuck it away. Then the really cool part, well, not when it's hot, is access to the center wing box. So the center wing box is essentially the chassis of the aircraft. It's the most important piece of the aircraft. You'll notice the hatch here, and that actually leads all the way forward into the flight deck. Additionally, anybody can crawl out in the center wing box to access all four engines, whether checking on oil, adding oil, or doing anything else, they would go through there. One other thing that I'd like to share with you in this journey, many-month journey with Philippine Mars from Lake Pleasant to Peay Mare Space Museum, when we lifted the center wing box, the biggest challenge was finding all the bolts that connected this center wing box to the fuselage. So you notice that big one there, these are retaining ones in, but that one connects to here along with a couple of others. Now, fun little factoid, this was the third aircraft of the 7 built. She's technically the second production aircraft, but she became the first production aircraft because the second aircraft that was built, Hawaii Mars #1, actually had a mishap shortly after being built. So everything then went from the Philippine Mars on. Now the funny thing is we had the TOs for the prototype and Hawaii Mars, but we didn't have Hawaii Mars #1, but we didn't have the TO for this aircraft. So as the center wing box was being pulled out of the aircraft, we found out, it took 3 days, that there were some surprise bolts that we didn't know about, which we had to remove more panels and then remove those bolts, and then the center wing box came out. So big thing about center wing boxes, you don't want them to come out of aircraft, so it was a good thing. So with that, we're going to continue forward, or actually we're going to go back to the rear and check out downstairs and then back upstairs. So as we're walking through the aircraft, you'll notice these racks here, and they're actually portions to lock into the leading edge of the wing. So any maintenance that needed to be done on the engines, they could do it while standing on these stands. So they actually had a essentially L shape that was locked into the front of the wing, and then they could stand there and pull the engine open or the panels open and start working on the engine as needed. Downside is this was only done on water, and if you lose a socket, it's gone. Now we're going to go back downstairs and we're going to go check out the water tank and explore that whole history as a firebomber. So we're back downstairs and we're making our way forward, but before we get there, I want to show you the bottom of the floor for upstairs. So you'll notice right here where the cross beams are, there's actually little pieces of wood to help strengthen the floor upstairs. So as time went on and more equipment was loaded into the aircraft, they noticed the floor started having its own flexibility that was unneeded. So simple system, a little piece of wood put in there, and it braced it and kept it strong. So with that, we're going to move forward and look into the main cargo area. Now, this area, initially when she was built in World War II, was set up where there was 2 doors on either side. They could bring in the cargo and then move it back in here and then lock it down. So you'll notice little pieces in the floors where the tie downs used to be that were removed. And then over time, she then became a fire bomber in the late 50s, early 60s. And so the idea was, in order to have effective fire bomber, they wanted to get as much water into the aircraft. And the way they did that is they built a water tank that could hold about 7,000 gallons of water. Now, how do you get that water into the aircraft really quickly? Simple system. We nicknamed them ice cream scoops. And essentially, this is covered up so nobody steps in there and falls down. There were 2 scoops that could be hydraulically lowered into the water as the aircraft is skimming across the water at 100+ knots. And those scoops then went and fed into the tank. So there were no motors, and it would actually use gravity to feed all the water into these tanks, and they could do it in under 30 seconds. So if you think about that, 7,000 gallons in under 30 seconds is a lot of water moving really quickly. With that, we'll move into the water tank proper, and you'll notice right along the edge, this was actually built out of primarily plywood. It had metal reinforcement and cross arms inside to keep the tank together, but what they learned very quickly is the amount of stress of 7,000 gallons in 30 seconds can really start putting a lot of fatigue on metal. So the decision was, let's use plywood. And the fun part, if you start looking at the little details, they put a resin base here and then fiberglass on the sides. And that helped preserve the wood so it would take the expansion and the contraction and then be able to handle all that water. Now, the next thing to show you is, if you look here, you'll notice the sort of light green metal piece, and that is one of the 4 doors that would release all the water out of the aircraft. So as they went in on the fire and were about to drop on the fire, they would open these up and out all the water would go. Now, one other mechanism that they had that was very clever and very simple was, as the water is flowing into these water tanks, they have rectangular pieces in each one of these tanks that would pop open to vent the air out. And then all the way on the top is another set of vents. So as the tank is filling up, air is going out, and they would have one crewman looking out one of the portholes, looking at the bottom of the wing. And they knew the water tank was full when water started coming out just below the wing. So it was an ingeniously simple system to know that, hey, we have 7,000 gallons and now we can get back in the air. So as we move forward, we'll notice the little pathway here. So with the Philippine Mars, there were 2 ways to go from the back to the front. You could crawl at the bottom of the water tank. You'll notice here that the tank was actually on a stand, and that way the crew could get from the back to the front. The other alternative was through the center wing box. Both were very tight space. All right, so we're in front of the water box for the firebombing aspect of the aircraft. So more cargo space up here. And what I really want to point out to you is the refueling compartment. So this little space in here controlled where all the fuel went in the aircraft. So 6 tanks below us, and you'll notice as we've walked around, there's a little red covered piece there, and that's actually got the fuel gauge inside for that tank, and there's another one here. And the way the fuel system worked in the aircraft is it would be pumped in from the side and it would be distributed out between the 6 tanks. Now there are 2 tanks, each 500 gallons, out in the wings that would actually ready support the engines as the aircraft is flying. So there are 2 pumps, one here and one there, and that separated those out, and they would go then up and out to those tanks. Now, if those pumps died, you've got 500 gallons of fuel, so essentially 250 per each engine, because it's 4 engines. There's a manual override in case any one of these fails that you can actually start pumping the fuel. So you can get 20 gallons of fuel a minute upstairs or up into the wings, but it takes 100 pumps. So that's 2 a second. So pretty darn fast, and you've got to have somebody who really loves using their arms to pump around in there. So one other thing we'll look at if inside the refueling compartment in there is you can see all the lines that start moving in. So there are the 2 lines that are coming out that are going up into the wings, and then how it's separated out. They actually do have a fuel separator, so if any water gets in there, it can actually separate that from the fuel and you don't mess up the engines. Now, our next stop, we're going to move forward, and the handy dandy battery compartment is right here. There's a nice tag saying don't connect the 2 because then bad things happen. So there are the 2 24-volt batteries to power up the auxiliary power units upstairs, which then in turn start the engines. So again, more hatches. You'll notice this one right here. I'm just going to disconnect it. Essentially the water line is about 1.5 feet below us. So water coming in here was an ever-present threat. And if they started taking water, they would actually close these hatches up. Now, the fun part of this aircraft and why it's a flying boat is because it comes with its own anchor. So right in front of me here is a 100-pound anchor. There's a metal piece, so they'll open this door, slide that arm out, and then they can toss the anchor out into the water, and that would anchor the aircraft if it had no place to tie up. And part of the reason the aircraft was named Philippine Mars is the whole series, with the exception of the prototype, were named after Pacific archipelagos. So you have Marshall Mars, Philippine Mars, Hawaii Mars, you had Marianas Mars, and so the idea was these aircraft would be able to fly all the way across the Pacific to these islands that are very remote, don't have a landing strip, don't have a dock, and they could land, toss the anchor off over on the side, and then be able to offload all the cargo that would then go out to the island. Now, you'll notice behind me this little space. So what I'll do is be able to give you a view out the front, and I call this the Titanic jack spot, where in the movie Titanic, Jack is up out in front. So you can see the view, which is pretty darn cool. And the reason this is here is if we look down, you'll notice this is a tie-off for weights here to keep the aircraft from moving around. And that would actually be used to tie off to the aircraft when it was in the water. Now, the next thing that I'll show you that's pretty cool is right above me are 2 things. One, the controls. So this is the rudder here. And then we've got the elevator, I believe, is this one. And so these are the controls that we saw earlier that go through the entire aircraft and then up. And then right above me is the cockpit. So it's kind of cool that you can actually see the pedals right up there, wherever my finger is, because I'm looking backwards. So kind of cool. Here's the anchor line. So boats generally have anchor chain. This one has anchor line. So super simple system. And then a little winch motor for it, which definitely looks original. I haven't checked. And then again, one more access portal, ways to tie off the aircraft. Again, ropes. We'll tie it to a dock or wherever she needs to be tied off. The other cool thing that we really like when we're working on aircraft is we look at how they're left. So when an aircraft goes to a museum, generally it's left as is. So you'll notice all the maintenance aspect and then the to-do list or checklist in this case about what to do and how to anchor. So it's kind of cool. Now, the really, really fun part that I love showing people is the time machine. And this is why I've saved this for last. So up this ladder is our time machine that's going to take us back to the 1940s. So follow me and we'll go take a look. Okay, so we're up on the flight deck, and the first stop is the flight engineer station, very much the time machine. We've been really fortunate on the Boneyard Safari side as we've shared about this aircraft, where family members have shared photos of their relatives in this aircraft and the other aircraft. And specifically, the really standout point is this. So this is the fuel control system, and we've had some photos sent in where it shows their family relative sitting here. Generally, we can tell it's the Pacific because they're in shorts, and generally they don't have a shirt on. So guessing it's just as warm as it feels now. So getting to this is the fuel control system. You can see where everything is lined up. It tells you where the tanks are. So left wing tank, right wing tank, and then all the fuel controls for down here. So that's how they would move the fuel through the aircraft and up to the engines. Now, there have been some questions of why the fuel tanks were down in the hull of the aircraft, and that actually is because they provided ballast and in turn would not have essentially wet wings or a lot of weight on the wings. The other thing I'd like to show you here, so flight engineer station, so back in the day before computers, the flight engineer ran the show. So he had also control of the throttles, that if he moves the throttles here, they move up in the cockpit. So the cool thing about the flight engineer is flight engineer can actually operate the throttles from the flight engineer station back here. So if the pilots weren't paying attention, the flight engineer could actually take control. And my personal running joke, back in the days when there were flight engineers, flight engineer ran the aircraft, those guys just took off and landed. That's it. And then the other little aspect that we like to point out is the original dials are somewhat yellowed from years of exposure to the sun and light, and then the newer ones are actually white, so you can tell the difference. So it's kind of cool when you're like, hey, this is from the 1940s. One other fun fact, when an aircraft comes to a museum like Pima Air and Space, if they fly directly in and leave the aircraft, they'll leave, like I mentioned earlier, all the checklists, and then you'll see little things like the pencil is still there for the notes. And then, for example, here's the checklist for this aircraft for running the flight engineer station. So it's pretty darn cool. One other little factoid, this aircraft does come with a closet, and in the closet are some original, or what we think are original hangers, because they've got the loops on there so they can't leave. And yeah, that's just one of the closets. So very traditional. Put your flight jacket in there, and then if I get this closed, there we go. So back here is the other side of the center wing box. So this is the front edge of the center wing box, and when we were in the rear upstairs, I showed you the hatch, and that actually allows you to climb forwards or backwards. So simple system, very noisy in there. I've explored in there. It's very easy to get lost, and when it's hot like it is now, not fun. So with that, I'm going to take you forward, and up here is the navigator station. So the navigator operated a sextant, and the sextant porthole essentially was right here. You can still see some of the mounting pieces for that porthole. And flying across the Pacific, you don't have really an easy way to figure out where you are. So Celestial Navigation, they had their charts, they could figure out where they were, and then tell the pilot where to go, left turn, right turn, etc. Up here we have the radio operator's desk. So these two desks are original to when the aircraft was built. They're photos of this space, and the radios before micronization were located right here. Now there's a seat. So the radios, of course, are a lot more compact and they're a lot smaller, but back in the day there was a whole rack here for the radio and the radio operator. And not a bad seat if you look at it, cushions are good. And keep in mind, an average flight for this aircraft from the west coast of the United States to Hawaii was anywhere from 20 to 24 hours. So it's a long, slow, low flight getting across. Now, you've probably been waiting for getting up to the cockpit and checking it out. So I'm going to jump in the pilot seat here real fast and share with you a little bit about the cockpit. No, this is not a club. This is just to keep the control surfaces from moving around when she wasn't flying, which is pretty valuable. Now, throttle control's right here, and you can actually still hear the lines moving in the aircraft. One thing I'll point out to you, the two center pieces are, the handles are made out of wood, and the reason why is when this flying boat was on the water, it became a boat. So engine number 2 and engine number 3 were actually reversible. The propellers were reversible, and so they would actually use these in different formats to turn the Philippine Mars as she was motoring along in the water. So pretty ingenious system. Now the rule was that when the aircraft was in the water, they changed from their regular aircraft radios to marine radios. So there was a handheld radio over there, and one pilot had to stand up right through here and guide the aircraft using these two handles. So the reason they're wood is if he took his hand off, or she took her hand off, you reach down and quickly determine, nope, that's wood, there's my center, and that's how I operate the aircraft. One other thing to share with you about the aircraft, the panel is pretty much identical to when she was built in 1944, with a few exceptions. Right here, newer instruments, and then of course a GPS and newer radios. But apart from that, it's original. And one other little fun factoid I'd like to show people is the flap control right here. So normal large aircraft have incremental flap controls, so 5, 10, 15, 25, 30, 40 degree flap controls. There's only 3 settings: up, down, or takeoff and approach. So because she was very slow and also she had a huge wingspan, there was pretty much a set piece for those flaps to be down. Apart from that, she is original. You do see little things like the ashtray is still in here, and there are cigarette butts in one of them, and I'll leave that be. You'll notice this little piece here, and that was for them to utilize their radios. The headsets are still in the aircraft, and this is what we love about our job, is we get to see these aircraft, and you can see it is original and has some wear on it, and it has the pilot's name. So kind of cool. Anything else up here? Oh, so trim tabs. Those are the smaller sections at the end of a wing or horizontal stabilizer or on the tail. And to make those adjustments, so as you're flying along and let's say the wind is pushing you this way, you need to be going just a little bit that way. So they just make the adjustment by a couple degrees, and that adjusts so the wind isn't really pushing the aircraft to the side. And same thing about going along like this and the nose starts coming up, you rotate this down or up as needed. So very simple system, and it worked like a charm. And of course the seats are original. The padding, I'm not sure, but it looks pretty good condition, so hard to say. But if you drop the arm, pretty comfy spot. Then again, if you've got to fly 20 hours and you're shifting off every 8 hours in between flight crews, it's still pretty comfy. So now let's take a walk a little bit further back. One other thing I want to show you up here is the wonderful Mighty Martin Mars book, which you can actually find through Pima Air and Space at their gift shop. But one personal note, whenever we move an aircraft, we really like to make it a personal connection. So we had, on this trip, ADOT, state troopers, help us. We had, I can't think, there must have been 60 linemen help lift lines and get us here to Pima Air and Space. So one thing I want to share with you, to make it so personal, we had everybody that was a part of it sign the book. And so as you can see, the book has gotten some wear and started falling apart a little bit, but it's been pretty cool to see everybody getting a moment to be a part of the history of the Philippine Mars and her journey here to Pima Air and Space. All right, so we're up here on the flight deck, and the several things I want to show you up here is there's a hatch that you'll notice right there, and while they were in flight, they would actually close that hatch so nobody made the mistake of falling down there, so good safety. Other cool spot is these two seats. Now, one thing I like to really show is it's got the original seat belts in here that go back to the 1940s. So Yeah, nice and heavy and very secure. One other thing here I want to show you is this little hatch that I pulled out, and the view is absolutely spectacular out there because you're looking out at the engines and at the wing. And if you look up at the wing, you'll notice some notches, and that's where they would put those stands that would go out so they could work on the engines. Now, one other thing I'll show you here is in order to get access to the top of the aircraft, there's some handholds, so you could actually climb up from the side of this aircraft while in the water, because the landing wouldn't be good out here in the dirt. So with that, we're finishing up on the flight deck. We're going to go downstairs. I'm going to share a little bit about aeromedical evacuation, and yeah, let's keep going. So as we go back out of the aircraft, again, you'll look up, you'll see all the control surfaces that come from the back and the main portion of the wing that I call aircraft yoga when I don't hit myself on anything. Again, we're back in the center wing, or the water box that was used for firebombing. And the other aspect that I wanted to share with you about the old lady, the prototype, the very first aircraft, in here, both downstairs and upstairs, they had litters. So the Navy was actually pioneering in aeromedical evacuation. So if you think about the MASH units in the Korean War between 1950 and 53, where they had helicopters taking wounded troops back to the MASH units and working on them, that was within essentially the golden hour. Now, during the Battle of Iwo Jima, the prototype, which is very similar to this aircraft, was out in the water, and as Marines and sailors and anybody else that was wounded taken off the beach at Iwo Jima, they would have basic triage, then be loaded on this aircraft and flown all the way back to Hawaii, where they would have the top tier medical attention. So 1945, the Navy was very much pioneering aeromedical evacuation. So let's go outside, take a look at the rest of the aircraft, and keep exploring. So over here, as I'm blinded by the sun, you'll notice this little piece, which is a zinc anode. So every single boat actually has one of those, and that helps prevent corrosion. So Philippine Mars and her sisters did spend a good amount of time in the water, so anything to help prevent corrosion was really good. You'll notice, if you look closely up here, you'll see a little bit of like a dirt line that goes along, and that essentially was the water line for the aircraft when she was sitting in the water. So kind of cool when you see those little touches of what she's been up to and her day-to-day life. And one other thing we want to share with you is this book, The Mighty Martin Mars, which is pretty darn cool, has been a good resource for us, and we get to see her big sister, the original, the prototype, and then we got to learn a lot about the aircraft and all the dynamics. So the anchor, the auxiliary power units, and my personal favorite is getting to see the aircraft that's the prototype, but this is the Philippine Mars in the 40s, and that desk is still there today. So it's pretty darn cool to see that. And one other thing that I want to show you is the hoist system, the cargo hoist system. So there are the tracks with the doors open under the wings, and then this would actually haul cargo into the aircraft. This is a great resource, has been our primary resource for the adventure with the Philippine Mars, and you can find this at Pima Air and Space at their gift shop, as well as their gift shop online that they now have. And I heard they're doing a bundle aspect, which would be kind of cool, coffee mug, shirt, anyway. So we're next to the aircraft, the Philippine Mars, and one thing that I'd like to point out, we talked about the water boxes inside and how the water came into the aircraft. And there are two essentially ice cream scoops that were mounted on the aircraft, and they actually went through the fuel tanks. Of course, they were sealed up, and those ice cream scoops were hydraulically powered, so they'd be pushed down about 6-8 inches, and they were reinforced steel. So at 100 knots, they would actually pick up 7,000 gallons of water, which would go shooting up into the water tank. And in 30 seconds, which is an incredible amount of water, and that's an incredible speed. So the reason they were behind the step, as you see right here, was to protect them, otherwise they would get ripped right off. It's taken off landings off so many times, and they would then be spring released back into place, so they were actually aerodynamic while it was flying. If we look at the original doors, they actually opened outwards. So when Philippine Mars was in her naval service, she had two doors that opened all the way out and cargo could be brought in. The other aspect is if we look at the bottom of the wing, you'll notice what looks like two tracks that have a lot of rivets and screws in them, and it actually had a dolly system that was mounted on the bottom of the wing that would slide out and be able to lift cargo, lift the beaching gear up and into the aircraft or out onto a dock or a boat. So it was quite incredible that this aircraft could actually be self-contained and take care of itself. And oftentimes it would fly out to an archipelago, land, deposit, take on, and then take off again without refueling. So if you notice here, we have the beaching gear. So Philippine Mars and her sisters do not have landing gear. She's a dedicated flying boat, very much like the Spruce Goose, just a little bit smaller and two less engines. So the beaching gear, this is original, tires are newer. You can notice the metal mounts here, and they weighed a lot, a ton, literally. You'll notice the two boxes. The boxes are actually hollow because they were full of air and actually floated the beaching gear in the water. And the way it worked was there's two essentially pinholes underneath, so they would push the beaching gear underneath and then lock it from the top, and therefore then be able to tow the aircraft out of the water. So the aircraft would always be towed out backwards because that was the strongest point for its towing side, and also that's where the tow bar is. And we'll actually go back there and take a look at that, and we'll be able to see where the Philippine Mars's heart is. So earlier we were upstairs and I pulled open a hatch and I talked about her heart. Well, the designers at Martin back in the 40s, I think, were very cool because the hatch, if you look at it, is in the shape of a heart. And that's pretty darn cool. So they would open up that hatch and then pull that out and then be able to get to this piece right here, which would be tied off to a buoy, and then be able to release it, and then the aircraft was free to move. So one other piece to share with you, she has a 200-foot wingspan. So that is equivalent to a Boeing 747. They're within 6 to 10 feet of each other. So this was the largest aircraft flying in World War II. The Old Lady, which had a different tail, it had a forked tail very much like an A-10, and the rest of the aircraft had a traditional tail. But these aircraft were the largest aircraft of their time before the newer ones came along. And it was pretty cool to see her have a second life, to go from retirement from the Navy in 1956 and then become a firebomber. And here we are in 2025, and she just flew 8 months ago, which is pretty impressive. So yeah, it's been a fun journey with the Philippine Mars, and I want to thank you and for joining us in our journey, because part of our job was to learn about the aircraft and go along with her. And now she's going to be going out on display at Pima Air and Space, so we invite you to come out and see her on display and learn a little bit about her history.